What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. We'd also like to give a special shout out to one of Not Your Average Meta's generous patrons, Martin Stanley, for everything he's done to help out the channel. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we did a Commander Masters draft and decided it would be fun to show off some of the decks we drafted to the fans. One way the Commander Masters draft differs from a normal draft is that you create a 60-card Commander deck, including your Commander or your Commanders, but the biggest difference is that you are allowed to draft any monocolor Commanders as though they had partner, which can allow for some really fun, never-before-seen partner pairings. This week's matchup features Levi, a newcomer to the channel, playing Kykar, Wind's Fury, Martin back again playing his Is It pairing of Ashling the Pilgrim and Ghost of Ramirez, DePietro, Fog Raw rocking the Orzhov pairing of Nixilis of the Black Oath and the Prismatic Piper, and then Jacob, who's also making his first appearance this season, playing Meren of Clandel Teth. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Levi plays an island while Martin plays a mountain for turn. Fog plays a tapped Path of Ancestry while Jacob plays a swamp for turn and pays 1 for Witch's Cauldron. Levi plays the Plains for turn and then pays 2 for an Arcane Signet, while Martin plays an island of his own, paying 2 to cast his Commander Ashling. Fog plays a Plains for turn and passes, while Jacob plays a Forest and then pays 2 for Fungal Plots. Levi plays another island for turn and then taps out to cast his Commander Kykar, Wind's Fury. Martin plays another island for turn and then pays 3 to cast a Loyal Drake. He then goes to combat and draws a card off his Drake's ability before swinging Ashling over Jacob for 1 Commander damage. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 3 in order to cast a Commander Sphere. Jacob plays another Force for turn and then pays 3 to cast a Bastion of Remembrance, which creates him a 1/1 Human Soldier token when it enters play. Levi plays another Plains for turn before he then casts a Thought Vessel, which has him creating a 1/1 Spirit token. He then pays to cast a Ministrant of Obligation before passing his turn to Martin, who plays a tapped Thriving Bluff for turn, choosing blue when it enters play. Martin then goes to combat, once again drawing a card and swinging his Drake over Jacob for 2 damage while he swings his Commander over Fog. Second main, he casts a Gutter Snipe before passing his turn to Fog, who plays a Plains for turn. Fog then pays 2 and casts an Arcane Signet before then paying 3 to cast a Drown in Sorrow. This then gives all the creatures in play -2/-2 until end of turn. Levi then also creates 2 spirits off his Ministrant dying, and Jacob plays a Swamp for turn. Jacob then pays 4 and casts a Sky Shroud Clan, which has him going into his library to get 2 forests to put into play untapped. Levi plays an island for turn and goes straight to combat, swinging his Commander over Martin for 3 Commander damage. Martin draws for turn and then pays 4 to cast a Crimson Fleet Commodore, which has him becoming the Monarch when he enters play. He then goes to his end step drawing a card while Fog plays a Plains for turn. Fog then taps out to hard cast a Meteor Golem, which he uses to blow up Jacob's Bastion. Jacob plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 4 in order to cast his Commander, Ramirez. He then also pays 2 to cast a Carrier Throw and ends his turn. Levi draws for turn and then casts an Explorer Scope, which has him creating a 1/1 Spirit token. He then pays to equip his Commander with the Explorer Scope before he then goes to combat, swinging him over Martin again for 3 Commander damage. This then triggers his Scope, which has him revealing the top card of his library, which is a mountain that he gets to put into play tapped, while Martin takes his 3 damage and Levi becomes the Monarch, drawing on his end step. Martin draws for turn, then pays 4 to cast a Fact or Fiction. This then has him revealing the top 5 cards of his library and choosing Fog as his opponent to separate him into 2 piles. Fog then decides to keep the game spicy by making 1 pile of 0 and 1 pile of 5, which has Martin taking the pile of 5. Martin then plays a mountain as his land for turn and pays 1 for an Impulsive Pilferer, before he then goes to combat, swinging his Commodore over at Levi for 5 damage in order to become the Monarch once again. Martin then goes to his end step drawing a card from being the Monarch, while Fog also draws for turn. Fog then floats a mana off his Command Sphere before he then sacks in order to draw an additional card. He then plays a Plains as his land for turn and uses his floating mana to help him cast his Commander, Nixilis. Fog then pays 2 to cast a Cartographer's Hawk before he upticks his Commander, which has each opponent losing a life while he gains 3 life. Fog then goes to combat and swings his Golem over Martin for 3 damage in order to become the Monarch. He then goes to his end step drawing a card while Jacob uses his Witch's Cauldron to sack his Carrier Thrall and create an Eldrazi Scion token. This also gains him a life and draws him a card before he goes to his upkeep drawing for turn. He then pays to cast a pair of Lightning Greaves before he then equips him to his Commander. Jacob then triggers his Commander on his end step, returning the Carrier Throw from his graveyard back to his hand. Levi plays another mounted return before hard casting a Cryptic Serpent. He then makes a deal with Fog to swing 1 Spirit at him for 1 damage in order to become the Monarch, while he also swings his commander over at Martin for 3 more commander damage. This then also triggers his Explorer scope and he looks at the top card of his library, which isn't a land. He then goes to his end step drawing while Martin untaps return and draws. Martin then pays 2 to suspend a Gargadon with 4 counters on it before passing his turn to Fog. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 8 to hard castle top up Primal Dawn. He then upticks his commander once again, making each of his opponents lose a life while he gains 3 life. Jacob draws for turn before he then pays 3 in order to cast Slimefoot the Stowaway and then an additional 2 to recast his Carrier Thrall. He then pays to once again sack the Thrall, creating a Scion token, gaining a life and drawing a card. On his end step, his commander then triggers, returning the Thrall back into play. Levi draws for turn and then goes to combat, attacking Martin this time with both his commander and his serpent. In response, Martin flashes in a Portal Mage, choosing to have his commander attack Fog instead of himself. To prove a point, Fog takes the damage while Levi looks at the top card of his library, which isn't a land. In his second main phase, Levi casts a Frantic Search, which has him drawing 2 cards, before he then discards 2 cards and untaps 3 of his lands. He then draws on his end step from being the Monarch, while Martin untaps return and removes a counter from his Gargadon. Martin then draws return and then casts a Rapacious Dragon, which creates him 2 treasure tokens when he enters play. Martin then goes to combat, once again swinging his Commodore over at Levi, dealing 5 damage in order to become the Monarch. Martin then ends his turn drawing while Fog untaps for turn. He then plays a Swamp for turn before paying 2 and casting a Felwar Stone, and then going to uptick his commander, having each of his opponents lose a life while he gains 3 life. Fog then goes to combat, swinging his Atalpa over at Jacob, taking him down to 29 life, before he then pays 5 and casts his other commander, the Prismatic Piper. Jacob draws for turn, then pays 2 to cast a Rot Shambler, before he then pays more mana and sacks his Eldrazi tokens, putting counters on the Rot Shambler in order to help him cast a Sky Snare Spider. He then once again goes to his end step, returning his Thrall back into play from his graveyard. Levi plays the Plains for turn before paying 8 in order to cast an Ulamog's Crusher. He then goes to combat, swinging a Serpent over at Martin, who chump blocks with his Pilfer, which has him going to the graveyard and creating him another treasure token. Martin removes another suspension counter from the Gargadon while he untaps and draws for turn. He then plays another island for turn before paying 6 in order to cast Rorik's Bladewing. Fog draws for turn and then down takes his commander in order to create an Ob Nixilis emblem. He then pays 1 to cast a Supernatural Stamina targeting his Meteor Golem before he then pays to sack it to his Ob Nixilis ability. This then has his Golem dying and then coming back into play, using it to blow up the Ulamog's Crusher. He then gains 5 life off sacrificing the Meteor Golem before he then draws 5 cards. Fog then plays a Swamp as his land for turn before paying 3 and casting a Loyal Subordinate. Fog then casts a Boom Pile and goes to combat, having each of his opponents lose 3 life because of the Subordinate. He then once again swings the Tapa over at Jacob, who blocks with his Spider but still takes 2 damage. On his end step, Jacob does the same song and dance of sacking his Thrall to create a Scion, gaining a life and drawing a card. He then draws to start his turn before playing a Forest and paying 4 to cast Whisper Blood Liturgist. Jacob then also pays 2 to cast a Mirror Seer before using his commander's ability to return a Spider back to play from his graveyard. Levi draws for turn and then protects himself by enchanting Zoltapa with a Spectral Grasp. He then goes to combat, once again swinging his commander over at Fog for 3 more commander damage. Martin removes another counter from his Gargadon and then draws for turn. He then plays a Mountain as his land for turn before going to combat, swinging his Commodore back over at Levi, who responds by dealing 3 damage to it with an Abrade. Second main phase, Martin casts a Skyline Depot, which has him becoming the Monarch once again and drawing on his end step. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 6 to cast a Phyrexian Gargantua, which has him losing 2 life and drawing 2 cards when it enters play. Fog then upticks his commander once again, making each of his opponents lose a life while he gains 3 life. He then pays to sack the Gargantua, which has him gaining 4 life and then drawing 4 cards. Fog then pays to cast a Thrawn Dynamo and then a Prophetic Prism, which has him drawing a card when it enters play. But before Fog can go to combat, Martin destroys his Loyal Subordinate with an Abrade of his own. Fog then goes to combat, swinging his Zoltapa over Jacob once again, which has him blocking with the Spider but still taking 2 damage. On his end step, Jacob sacks his Mirror to his Cauldron, which has him gaining a life and drawing a card while he creates a Mirror token. Jacob draws return and then pays to cast a Bloodspawn Thranex, and in response to the ETB trigger, he pays to create a Sapling token. He then sacks 4 of his creatures to the Devour trigger, which has each of his opponents losing a life, and the Bloodspore Thralax entering with 4+1/+1 counters on it. He then goes to his end step, returning a Spider back into play. Levi draws return and then casts a Living Lightning. He then goes to combat, swinging a Serpent over at Fog, who for some reason thinks the Serpent has trample, so he double blocks, and in response, Levi casts his Shelter, giving his creature protection from white, which has him creating a Spirit token while he also draws a card. Both of Fog's creatures then die, and Levi casts a Cyclops Electromancer, which comes into play, destroying Martin's dragon. But on his upkeep, Martin gets a 5/5 dragon because he's the Monarch, before he then remembers to remove the last counter off his Gargadon, which then has him casting it for free. He then draws return and plays an island before he goes to combat. He then swings his newly cast Gargadon over at Levi, who double blocks with 2 of his creatures and has all 3 of the creatures going to the graveyard. Martin then pays to cast a Hoarding Dragon, which has him going to his library to see if he even has an artifact to exile to his ability. Martin finally then casts his second commander, Ghost of Ramirez DePietro, and passes his turn. Fog draws and then casts a Feed the Swarm in order to destroy Jacob's Spider. This then has Fog losing 6 life before he then pays to cast a Savine's Reclamation, returning his loyal subordinate back into play from his graveyard. Fog then pays to cast a Dread Drone, which has him entering play with 2 Eldrazi spawn tokens, which he then immediately sacks in order to help him cast the Sandstone Oracle. On ETB, Fog chooses to pick Martin in order to draw 3 cards off the Oracle trigger. Fog then upticks his commander once again, draining everybody for life while he gains 3. Fog then goes to combat, draining his opponents for 3 life before he swings Zoltapa over at Martin, who blocks with 2 of his dragons, which has Fog choosing to destroy the token. Jacob plays a Swamp for turn before paying to cast a Jade Mage and going to his end step, returning a Spider back into play. Levi draws return and then once again casts a Frantic Search to return to his hand, which has him drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards while he untaps 3 lands. Levi then casts a Blood Aspirant before paying to Encore's Impulsive Pilfer from his graveyard. This then has a Pilferer copy going to each of his opponents while he also swings a Serpent over at Fog.
Whoa.
I got this one.
Okay,
Boom pile.
you do it.
Oh, he's actually doing
Oh,
it.
boom pile got boomed.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna call heads. This homie's heads.
All right.
Tails.
Everyone then blocks the respective Pilfer, which has Levi creating 3 treasure tokens. Martin plays a Mount of Return before he then remembers to create his dragon token. He then also pays to cast Brineland the Moonkraken, which has him bouncing Zoltapa back to Fog's hand and then enchantment going to Levi's graveyard. Martin then goes to combat, swinging his 2 dragons over at Fog, who decides to chump block with both of his flyers. Martin then casts a Deranged Assistant, drawing on his end step. Fog plays a Plains for turn and then casts a Kindred Dominance, choosing zombies. In response to this, Levi casts a Resculpt, turning Fog's zombie into an elemental token. All the creatures then get wiped off the board because of the Kindred Dominance, and Jacob gains a bunch of experience counters and creates a Scion token. Fog then downticks his commander in order to create a 5/5 demon token and loses 2 life, before he then pays 4 and casts Thorn of the Black Rose, which has him becoming the Monarch when she enters play. He then also pays 5 to flash back his Savine's Reclamation from his graveyard, which has him getting back his Cartographer's Hawk as well as his Commander's Fear. Jacob draws for turn and then pays to cast his commander a second time, before he then equips her with her Greaves and goes to his end step, returning the Spider back to play from his graveyard once again. Levi draws return and then also pays to cast his commander a second time, before he then also pays to re-equip it with the Explorer Scope. Martin plays a Mount of Return before he pays 6 in order to cast a Windcaller Aven to use as a blocker, before he then also pays to recast his commander Ashling a second time. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then pays to cast a Demon's Disciple, which has each player sacrificing a creature when he enters play. Fog then pays to cast Tashar Ancestor's Apostle, before he then pays to recast Zoltapa, which then triggers Tashar, returning his Disciple back into play, having each player once again sack another creature. Fog then upticks his commander once again, draining the table for 1 while he gains 3 life. He then sacks his commander sphere to draw a card before he then pays to cast a Wanderer's Strike, exiling Jacob's Spider for good while he also proliferates the counters on his commander. Fog then finally goes to combat, swinging his demon over Jacob, taking him to 13 life, while he swings his hawk over at Martin, taking him down to 14 life. Jacob draws for turn and then pays to cast a Crawling Infestation, as well as paying to cast a Cabal Patriarch. He then equips his Patriarch with the boots before he then goes to his instep, returning the Jade Mage back into play from his graveyard. Levi draws for turn and then pays 3 to cast a Bonner's Ornament before he then pays 4 in order to tap it and draw another card. Martin plays a Mount for turn before he pays to cast a Rapacious One, as well as casting a Ravaging Blast where X is equal to 3, which deals 3 damage to Tishar, sending him to the graveyard and 3 damage to Fog. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then casts a Corpse Augur, picking Martin when he enters play. This is when Fog knew he messed up and he loses 17 life and draws the rest of his deck. He then casts an Unbound Potential, putting a counter on his demon as well as the top-up before he then proliferates his counters. Fog then tries to cast a second Unbound Potential and Levi says no way and counters it with a counterspell. Fog then casts a Darksteel Mutation, enchanting Kearney's commander before he then casts a Priest of the Blood Right. Fog then goes to combat, swinging creatures at each of his opponents, which puts Jacob at 1 life, Martin at 5 life, and Levi at 9 life. He then decides if he's going out, everybody's going with him.
Before I go to
Your death?
my
Your
death,
death?
I'm going to Boom Pile.
This is untapped.
Oh, his vision. So heads.
Heads.
This then fails and he gets taken out of the game by his own greed, and Jacob draws for turn. Jacob then casts a Nadir Nightblade and equips her with his Swiftfoot boots, giving her haste. He then goes to combat, swinging out at Martin with all of his creatures, and Martin declares blocks with his 1 creature. In response, Jacob activates his Cabal Patriarch to destroy the creature, and Martin gets taken out of the game. Jacob then returns his Thornyx back to play from his graveyard, and Levi knows he can't create enough blockers on his turn, so he scoops the game up to Jacob. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.